When you're on the ground in a busy airport area, if the controller doesn't have time to work with you, he knows what to do. He tells you to stand by and simply leaves you sitting where you are on the ground. But once you're airborne, he's got a whole different problem on his hands, because airplanes can't just stand by in one spot once they're in the air. So what the controller will do is put you in a holding pattern. Now, the whole purpose of a holding pattern is to act as a parking garage, a place to hold airplanes until there's room for them in the traffic flow again. A holding pattern looks like a racetrack. It's got two straight legs and two half circles connecting those straight parallel legs, anchored at any kind of a navigation fix. Now, a holding fix can be anything you can identify with your navigation radios. It could be a VOR, an NDB, a locator outer marker, an intersection, a DME distance, or even a GPS fix. Just like the parking spaces in a garage have a defined location and orientation, holding patterns have a specific location and direction, although you won't find any yellow lines in the sky to help you along. I tried to get them to place yellow lines in the sky, but they thought it interfered with the sunsets. Go figure. Now, a holding pattern is always set up with one of the straight legs ending at a holding fix. That leg is called the inbound leg, the one where you're flying toward the fix, and that's important. Some holding patterns are printed on the IFR and route charts, or they can be found on the approach charts. But if the holding pattern ATC wants you to use isn't published on an IFR chart, then the controller will tell you where the inbound leg is located. When ATC describes a holding pattern, the direction of holding is where the inbound leg is physically located relative to the fix, not the direction you fly. This particular inbound leg is physically located on the east side of the fix, so you would be holding east of the fix. If the inbound leg were physically located up here, you would be on the north side of the fix and you'd be holding north of the fix. Now, if the controller's not having you use a published holding pattern, he'll not only tell you the direction, east in this case, he'll also tell you a radial or an airway. So he might say, hold east on the 090 radial, or hold east on Victor 66, for example. It's very likely that the airspace on one side of the inbound leg will have the equivalent of a no parking zone. ATC, for any number of reasons, doesn't want you over there. So ATC will tell you to make either a right or a left turn at the fix, depending upon which side they want you to fly your pattern. And it's important to fly your pattern on the holding side and not the non-holding side. ATC may have the non-holding side reserved as a buffer between you and other aircraft, or even keeping you away from terrain. The holding side is your protected airspace. The non-holding side, well, that's no man's land. Now, since those no parking zones don't show up in the clouds or any place else airborne, you'll need to get clear parking, holding instructions from ATC. Often these instructions will be a simple hold as published, because you'll see the pattern printed on your chart. So there will be no question about which way to turn. But if the holding pattern isn't published on the chart, then ATC expects you to make right turns, because right turns are standard in a holding pattern. Should ATC want you to go around your holding pattern to the left, they'll tell you so, because left turns are non-standard turns. Either way, those turns, both in the standard and non-standard direction, are standard rate turns, the same as you use in all your IFR flying. Now, how long should you make the straight legs? Well, in the days before almost complete radar coverage and precise cockpit navigation with DME and GPS, holding leg lengths were determined solely by time, and that with some exceptions, carries forward to today. If you're holding at or below 14,000 feet, your inbound leg should be 1 minute long. Although you'll probably never hold with your Skyhawk above 14,000 feet, you should know that the standard up there is 1.5 minute inbound legs. Now, another way to determine the holding leg length is to use DME or an IFR-approved GPS and fly a specific number of miles outbound from the navigation station, intersection, or waypoint. You can ask the controller for any reasonable leg length. In this case, your GPS or your DME is going to read 4 nautical miles, and it's sure a lot handier than timing the legs. In most cases, you will be timing the legs of the holding pattern. So the faster your airspeed in a holding pattern, the bigger the holding pattern gets. The FAA has established maximum holding airspeeds to keep the patterns within protected airspace. The lower the altitude at which you are holding, the slower the speed limit. If you're going to hold at altitudes up to and including 6,000 feet, don't let your indicated airspeed get over 200 knots. You won't hear a siren or see any flashing lights, but you might get outside the protected airspace. And folks, that's a lot worse than getting a ticket. Above 6,000 feet, up to and including 14,000 feet, the speed limit is 230 knots indicated airspeed. At these altitudes, you may occasionally see a lower airspeed, 210 knots, marked on the chart inside the holding pattern, meaning that this is the maximum speed to fly that particular holding pattern. Now, above 14,000 feet, there are fewer and usually faster airplanes, so ATC can allow more space. The speed limit is 265 knots indicated airspeed above 14,000 feet. On some approach charts designed for use by slower airplanes only, you'll see a holding pattern with the number 175 printed inside it. In that case, the maximum speed is 175 knots. Now, if you're going to have to slow down to meet a speed restriction, ATC doesn't want you to do it too early. They want you to maintain your filed true airspeed until you estimate you're within 3 minutes or less of arriving at the holding fix. Just make sure you're down to your holding speed when you first cross the fix to ensure you stay in the protected airspace. Let's talk about what your clearance to enter a holding pattern will be like. If you're not going to be flying a published holding pattern, your holding instructions from the controller will always tell you 3 things, without which you won't have enough information to hold. These 3 things are the fix to hold at, the direction of holding, including the radial or airway, and a time called an EFC, or expect further clearance time, by which the controller will get back to you with further instructions. And you should never accept holding instructions without getting an expect further clearance time. It's your escape hatch in case you lose communications while you're in the holding pattern. We'll talk more about lost communications later on. Finally, the controller might need to tell you 3 other things. The altitude to maintain, included only if it's different from your current altitude usually. The direction of turns, if the controller wants non-standard left turns. And finally, the leg length in miles if you're asked to use distance instead of time. So holding instructions at the Bartlesville, Oklahoma VORTAC might sound like this. Clear to the Bartlesville VORTAC, hold northwest on the 310 radial, expect further clearance at 2035, time now 2021. So you would be holding northwest in this area right here. Then when you reach the holding fix and actually enter holding, you tell the controller the time you first crossed the holding fix and your altitude. This report gives the busy controller confirmation that you're actually entering holding and will not fly into airspace beyond the holding pattern. Likewise, to avoid confusion, you are also required to report to the controller when you leave holding. Well, now you know there is always a chance that you may get sent to that big parking garage in the sky, and you know what your space will look like when you get there.